To begin, I wanted to thank, again, Eve and Allison Schocket for their support of the annual lecture. And I'd also like to acknowledge also the organizational work of Professors Christoph Cox, Mary Russo, Lee Sanders, as well as Professor Norman Holland, Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Cultural Studies, and the Assistant to the Dean, Linda McDaniel, for all the work that she has done and always does. I wanted to give a special thanks to Professor Alicia Ellis for her work on this event, as well as David Munson, who designed our wonderful posters and postcards and other materials. So thank you to all of them. I'm honored to be introducing Professor Eric Lott for the 4th annual Eric and Schocket Memorial Lecture on Class and Culture. I did not have the privilege of knowing Professor Eric Schocket, whom this lecture honors, but I still feel his impact on campus, so to continue in that vein for just another minute. My colleagues often talk about the brilliance he brought to his classes. One of my current students has told me more than once that Professor Schocket's book, Vanishing Moments, has shaped his approach to his studies. I recently came across Professor Schocket's essay, Poor Like Me, on the Cabinet Magazine website, in which he critiques the class masquerade that Barbara Ehrenreich performs in her book, Nickeled and Dimed. Just yesterday, I shared that article with a student in my American Studies seminar who is currently designing her Division III project for next year, examining how formations of class, race, ethnicity, and gender inform the recent successful campaign for domestic workers' rights in New York City. This student has been struggling with Ehrenreich's approach to gender and class, and so I was pleased to be able to share Eric Schocket's piece with her. And Schocket's Poor Like Me, it seems to me, is in conversation with the work of today's speaker, Professor Eric Lott. While the former has examined class masquerade in all its gendered and raced forms, the latter has frequently explored the classed and gendered aspects of racial masquerade. Lott's important essay, White Like Me, argued that John Howard Griffith's 1961 novel, Black Like Me, had a lot more to do with the construction of white masculinity than with its purported attempt to find out what it meant to live as an African American in the South. Instead, like Elvis's 1968 comeback and like Blackface Minstrelsy in the mid-19th century, Griffin's novel was about, to quote Locke, the necessary centrality and suppression of, quote, blackness in the making of American whiteness. Lott's 1993 book, Love and Theft, Blackface Minstrelsy and the American Working Class, was groundbreaking for showing how minstrelsy was not just a matter of expropriation or theft of Black subjectivity and performance practice, constructed and as invented as those practices often were, but also of desire, a kind of love indicated by the title Love and Theft. To quote Lott, underwritten by envy as well as repulsion, sympathetic in identification as well as fear, the minstrel show continually transgressed the color line even as it made possible the formation of a self-consciously white working class. His critique and analysis continue to resonate in today's heated debates, often raging on this campus about cultural appropriation, and I insist that you read it if you had not already. Lott has been a key figure in the revitalization of American studies, an interdisciplinary project that has turned in the past 20 years away from ahistorical studies of symbols like the frontier and the errand in the wilderness, toward an examination of the dynamics of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and ability in the formation of American identities and U.S. citizenship. Lott's work is a wide-ranging kind of cultural studies, taking as its objects film, literature, music, performance, intellectual discourse, and aesthetics. His most recent book, The Disappearing Liberal Intellectual from 2006, makes an impassioned case for a left liberal politics that avoids the compromises that have characterized the careers of many boomer intellectuals in and out of the academy. Lott has been a professor of American Studies at the University of Virginia since 1990, where he brought his interest in class and politics outside the classroom with his participation also in the campus's Living Wage campaign. And much of Lott's work has centered on the politics of performance and spectatorship and the way in which we define and are defined by the roles we play. His work is deeply historicized, but tends to trace histories that still haunt our present. These threads, I suspect, link his past work with his lecture for today, entitled Storming Heaven, Philippe Petit, Man on Wire, and the Reinvention of Lower Manhattan. It is a great honor and pleasure to bring Professor Eric Lott to Hampshire for the 4th annual Eric and Schocket Memorial Lecture. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle. This is very moving to me, and I'm very happy to be here to honor the life and work of Eric Schocket. And while we think of him, I hope we can continue to think of his intellectual and political interests as well. And that's what I've tried to try and help summon with what I've put together today. It's been great to meet new friends and see old ones, and in particular to meet Yves Schocket today. I am proud and honored to be speaking on an occasion that commemorates the life and work of Eric Schocket, with whom I feel an unusual intellectual and political kinship. We never met, but I remember very well it was something of an eye-rubbing moment. Picking up an application and writing sample he had submitted for a job at the University of Virginia sometime in the late 1990s. The sample discussed middle-class American authors at the turn of the 20th century and their interest in class transvestism. The desire by writers such as Stephen Crane, Theodore Dreiser, and Jack London to enter into proletarian lives in their fiction and reportage with distinctly sympathetic social and political aims, but with often contradictory or compromising political results. I didn't forget this essay, which was later to become Chapter 4 of Schocket's brilliant study, Vanishing Moments, Class in American Literature, certainly one of the finest scholarly books in the field over the last decade, and to my mind, one of the indispensable works on the politics of US literature ever produced. I don't think the essay stayed with me only because I had myself been interested in performative transvestism of a racial kind in the context of Blackface Minstrelsy, or that we had a name in common, or that I thought it would be great to have him as a UVA colleague. Hampshire got him instead. It was rather his fresh, indeed politically ventilated approach to the concept of class, his understanding of its frequent imbrication with racial demarcation, its figural complexity, its status indeed as less a stable identity than, as historian E.P. Thompson so often insisted, a set of relations between classes and class fractions. Class, then, not as social prime mover, still less as static taxonomy, but rather the social result of ongoing capitalist contradiction and conflict. Schocket's dialectical sensitivity to the formations and functions of class and culture is something I hope to emulate here today. And in fact, there are uncanny resonances between his vanishing moments and, well, mine. Schocket's book has as its epigraph a passage from Karl Marx on the historical formation of the United States, which did not develop on the foundations of the feudal system, but came rather, Marx says, from itself, the starting point of a new movement, which for Marx is, of course, both good news and bad news. In America, writes Marx, bourgeois society has developed to hitherto unheard of dimensions, and with unheard of freedom of movement, has far outstripped all previous work in the conquest of the forces of nature. Here, even the antitheses of bourgeois society itself appear only as vanishing moments. That's where his title comes from. I'd like to speak today about one such fragile, vanishing moment that emerged in brief antithesis to early 1970s bourgeois society in America, an art event of 1974 that made the briefest of ripples, only to reemerge in recent years in documentary film and novels both. It continues to resonate for me in the context of Eric Schocket's work because it intervened in and disrupted in displaced and condensed ways the emergence of a new kind of urbanism, and thus the new political economic regime that gave rise to it, while evincing a post-1968 political understanding of what Henri Lefebvre termed everyday life. Even the cover of Vanishing Moments anticipates my subject today with its famous 1931 skyscraper image by photographer Louis Hine, a worker hanging on 2 steel beams. That's the title of the picture. My talk is dedicated to the memory of Eric Schocket. First, a few remarks about a project I've started tentatively entitled Mirror Ball, A Cultural History of the 1970s. The 70s are too often seen as our embarrassing years, the decade of the dry look and Watergate, Three's Company and stagflation, EST and ESP, post-industrial decline and the bicentennial, Mandingo and the Steve Miller Band. Our narratives of the 1970s give us only an era of late imperial decadence, Vietnam, Studio 54, a self-interested me decade, Christopher Lash's Culture of Narcissism, an age of cults and terrorism, the Black Panthers, the Symbionese Liberation Army, how that trips off the tongue, Jim Jones's People's Temple, or a shallow, at best campy, culture of celebrity, Halston, Cher, Travolta, People magazine. My study, by contrast, will be guided by the hypothesis that the 70s are not only the most interesting post-World War II decade, but the one in which American culture in various, often unlikely or indeed inverted ways, capitalized on the promise of the 60s, even amid the culture's pervasive sense of post-heroic anno me. And I think Eric Schocket, born in 1966 and growing up in the 70s, would feel me on this. It's still kind of in gestation, and I have some other things to talk about, so I'm not going to say anything more about that project right now. But it involves trying to capture the decade's interest in roots moves, racial, cultural, ethnic, in a variety of ways, geographical even. A recasting of gender, sexuality, and desire in a variety of modalities, a new understanding of political economy, a turn to what's been thought of as anti-humanist thought and art, theory and theorizing and art, and a political culture of widespread left liberalism. That's for another day. In the middle of all this activity, hardly pivotal, but in some ways symbolically central, Philippe Petit's wire walk between the World Trade Center Twin Towers. The Paris Communards, wrote Marx in 1871, were ready to storm heaven. One of the Commune's own slogans was "à l'assaut du ciel," to assault the sky. Not quite 100 years later, a small but influential group of radical theorists in France called the Situationists celebrated the earlier insurgency by devising a host of political geographical concepts bent on capturing what Lefebvre termed le droit à la ville, the right to the city. May 1968 was, by many accounts, the historic outcome of this line of thinking, where the Communards responded to the brutal new streamlined boulevards of Baron Haussmann's Paris, I'll say more about that in a minute, with barricades and joie de vivre. In the same spirit, the Situationists demanded a reinvention of the sphere of everyday life. The group denounced the society of the spectacle, in Situationist Guy Debord's phrase, mapped a psychogeography of Paris, and advocated the détournement, the creative misuse of existing institutions, locations, and ideas. In August 1974, French street performer Philippe Petit made an illegal high-wire walk between the tops of the World Trade Center's newly completed Twin Towers, the subject of the recent documentary film Man on Wire, 2008, directed by James Marsh. I read this performance as being more squarely in a situationist tradition than anyone, including the brilliant Petit himself, has recognized. Petit's response to the Haussmannization of Lower Manhattan is a classic détournement, not explicitly political. It intervenes in the urban psychogeography of everyday life to reinvent not just the space between the towers, which, by the way, he does by producing a horizontality that connects them, in the process creating a pedestrian space between that did not exist before, but also spatial relations on the ground, where hundreds, if not thousands, of spectators looked on in delight, their city, their relations with each other, their relation to the towers, for a moment recast. Where Kristen Ross, a scholar, the author of The Emergence of Social Space, a book about the Paris Commune, and Arthur Rimbaud, the French poet, reads Rimbaud as the poet of the Commune, I read Petit as the post-68 skywriting performance artist of early 70s post-Fordist New York City, storming heaven. The facts are these. As recounted by Petit himself in his 2002 book, To Reach the Clouds, and later amplified in Man on Wire, an 18-year-old Petit, sitting with a sore tooth in a dingy Paris dentist's office in 1968, key year, read in one of the waiting room newspapers that a building complex was going up in New York whose two 110-story towers would soar 100 meters higher than the Eiffel Tower. As yet a novice funambulist, Petit nonetheless became obsessed with the idea of conquering the towers by wire walking between them. Coughing loudly, he liberated the news page containing the article and accompanying illustration, which he filed in his red projects box at home. Over the next several years, Petit perfected his tightrope technique, not least during his frequent street juggling, miming, and magic performances. Footage of these performances, which you get in Man on Wire, with Petit in battered top hat atop a unicycle, places him in a long tradition of vagabond autodidact circus acting, an aesthetic that still underwrites much of what he does, from pickpocket tricks to authorship itself. And in fact, on stage, as part of the team that accepted the Best Documentary Oscar for Man on Wire, Petit couldn't help briefly balancing the statue on his nose, and those things are heavy. I think you can probably find that on YouTube. It's a funny moment. His first big staged wire walk was between the towers of Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral, canonical Situationist target, which I'll talk about later, in 1971. His second came in 1973 between the two towers of a pylon upholding one end of Sydney's Harbour Bridge. And I'll play you a clip, which you can get. I mean, all this stuff is from Man on Wire. But this is from YouTube. Performances often come in three stages, most of which we got in that in the clip. There's the performance itself, which is astonishing. Then there's like the mess on the street, everybody looking up, traffic's going haywire, everybody's amazed and looking up and pointing, and then the police arrive, and that's the punchline always, right? It's because it's a crime. Who knows why? It's a crime. So the police van arrives and takes him away, and that's the end of that clip. It'll be the end of a later clip that we'll see, which is not on YouTube. So that will be good too. Yeah. Accomplices collected from both the Notre Dame and the Sydney Harbour Bridge walks helped plan Petit's coup, as he always calls it, his rigging of an illegal wire between the Twin Towers and walking across it. Working at his parents' estate in the French countryside, Petit and his co-conspirators erected a wire on which Petit practiced relentlessly. They built models of the World Trade Center and debated, at length and heatedly, how it should be rigged. Above all, they strategized how the wire, in actuality a several hundred-pound cable, was to be gotten from the roof of the South Tower to that of the North Tower, eventually settling on an arrow laced with fishing line shot by bow across the chasm, which would allow the pulling of progressively thicker lines and ropes, and ultimately the cable itself, across the gap. By his estimation, Petit, sometimes with colleague Jim Moore, visited the Twin Towers hundreds of times in the ensuing months, repeatedly scrutinizing every important aspect of the buildings, taking pictures, looking at blueprints, and making his own sketches, all of it aided by various disguises. From disabled man on crutches, he had in fact stepped on a rusty nail during one of his visits, to architectural journalist. He managed to hoodwink Port Authority World Trade Center head Guy Tozzoli into an authorized visit, to tourist, to construction contractor. So when he's walking across the wire, what you're seeing is a sort of condensed, congealed result of all kinds of activity and all kinds of temporality, actually. A long foreground of activity and plotting and planning and strategizing. So it's an art event, and it's a kind of occupation of public space that I think it's worth thinking more about. But by his own admission, Petit was more passionate than wise about securing all the details of his coup, and his friend Jean-Louis Blondeau more than once aborted plans for the walk in early 1974. Finally securing a few days off from work, in August, Blondeau agreed to meet Petit in New York to stage what Petit calls the artistic crime of the century. What followed was as much heist as high wire act. And Man on Wire presents it precisely in this narrative paradigm of heist. Aided by a couple of dubious Americans Petit picked up along the way, and who ended up betraying the operation by opting out at the last moment, the crew faked their way into the WTC, which I'm going to shorthand as World Trade Center from now on, with a half a ton of equipment, surely itself a major part of the crime, on August 6, 1974, and with the help of a WTC office worker, Barry Greenhouse, made it to the upper reaches of the towers. Constantly beset by security guards, their cover nearly blown on several occasions, hiding out under tarps for hours on end, the two teams of two finally reached the rooftops. They frantically rigged the wire all night. The break of dawn threatened to give the game away. At 6:45 a.m. on August 7th, Petit put his left foot on the wire and lifted his right one off the South Tower roof. For the next 45 minutes, and in the course of 8 crossings of the wire, Petit walked, danced, knelt and saluted, lay down, and according to him, almost fell asleep lying down on the wire. When he came off, an octopus of police, as he calls them, brutally took him into custody. And it's interesting, Eric Schocket would get the irony of him calling the police the octopus, a very Frank Norris kind of metaphor. A symptomatic reading of this performance reveals just how uncannily extensive a gesture it was. Now, I'm going to be kind of hard on the World Trade Center complex in the pages that follow. And I don't mean thereby to speak in any way about the events of September 11th, 2001, surely a tragedy by any estimation. I'm trying to project us back into a moment that Petit himself occupied in his wire walk, in which the World Trade Center towers were perceived in a certain kind of a way, which I think, at some level, Petit himself shared. As David Harvey has put it, the Twin Towers were not neutral or innocent spaces in the global or even local scheme of things. They symbolize the era of neoliberal globalization, the moment of transition from Fordism to flexible accumulation led by financialization of everything. Their brutal, doubled gigantism only proclaimed too redundantly the historical changes they instituted. Though nominally under the control of New York's Port Authority, the towers decisively aided a fundamental shift away from New York's status as a major U.S. seaport and toward its consolidating identity as a center of global finance, the center of global finance. Coming 1 year after the towers' official opening, only 1 year, they're 1 year old, Petit's coup conveniently mocked the post-Fordist pivot in New York City's political economy, which in part, of course, pushed the city to the edge of bankruptcy at just this moment. Feds to city, drop dead, being the resonant Daily News headline of the day, famous headline. Feds to city, can we borrow some money? Feds to city, drop dead. For this was the coming service economy, World Trade Center signaled, the coming service economy with a vengeance. Not for nothing is one study of the World Trade Center entitled City in the Sky. They didn't make anything up there. They facilitated it. As many as 50,000 office workers toiled in roughly 8 million square feet of new real estate crafted out of thin air. The buildings instantiated what they helped foster, since the WTC very much spurred the decline of manufacturing in New York City and the predominance of the FIRE industries, finance, insurance, and real estate, FIRE. The Sky City's distance from the street was written in stone in the form of the superblock. 16 square, chaotic blocks of Lower Manhattan were demolished in order to make way for the WTC Plaza, the Twin Towers' footprint, a granite plane that boosters like Austin Tobin, the plaza was christened after him, compared to Venice's beautiful and bustling Plaza San Marco, but which in fact always remained windswept, uninviting, underpopulated, alienating for sure. This, in turn, only registered the complex's roots in the urbanism and political economy of the 1950s, and in particular, the architectural proclivities of the Rockefeller family, whose other developed superblocks, Rockefeller Center, Lincoln Center, and One Manhattan Chase Plaza, paved the way for Lower Manhattan's Haussmanization. And when I invoke Haussmann, it's just the transformation in the middle of the 19th century from a chaotic, pedestrian city left over from medieval times into a newly streamlined boulevardier situation in which revolutionary barricades, among other things, revolutionary barricades cannot be thrown up anymore against the police. So a kind of rationalized political economy and urban scheme set down upon Paris to remake the city. New York's Baron Haussmann is properly and generally thought to be Robert Moses, who forthrightly described his interventions, such as the Cross-Bronx Expressway, as hacking his way through the city with a meat axe. That's a quote from him. And indeed, if not for the early 1960s activism of downtowners such as Jane Jacobs, author most famously of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, 1961, there would today run a connecting river-to-river expressway across Lower Manhattan, obliterating much of the Lower East Side. But Rockefeller Brothers Nelson, governor of New York from 1959 to 1973, precisely the span of the WTC's planning and building, and David, phantom-like Chase Manhattan financier and influential global thinker, planner, and organizer, did just fine on their own behalf, spearheading what can only be called a visionary late 1950s state capital partnership by way of an organization called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, the DMLA, bent on remaking the New York cityscape in the interests of finance capital. This took quite a literal post-Fordist form. Blocks devoted to retail sales of manufactured electronics goods, as well as to market stalls of flowers and other produce, known collectively as Radio Row, were raised and replaced outright after an extended series of neighborhood struggles stretching from the spring of 1962 up into the mid-1960s, with an organization put together by some of the owners of stores on Radio Row, the Downtown West Businessmen's Association, fighting the Rockefeller family, and Port Authority, tooth and nail, in the name of local family businesses. All this was razed after this extended, protracted struggle and replaced by an empty plaza that anchored the soaring office space that rose off the street into the sky in steel and glass structures of exquisite anonymity. The spiritual father of the superblock is, of course, Le Corbusier, whose dictum, "The plan must rule, death of the street," here found its perfect realization. The hubristic 50s vogue of urban renewal helped seal this deal. Cityscapes across the entire US were being radically transformed in this period, what we so take for granted in its kind of decaying afterlife at this point, coming into being right at this moment, giving post-Fordist political economies their distinctive architectural and urban shape. Formerly ethnically mixed-use residential commercial assemblages, neighborhoods with downtowns, were steadily refashioned as concentric circles of privatized downtown core, state-subsidized and racialized public housing, and suburban and exurban enclaves. The whole ensemble underwritten by massive federal investment in a whole variety of things, but particularly under Eisenhower in a new superhighway system, built to shuttle white, that too is new at this moment, built to shuttle white commuters to their downtown offices and commercial entertainments and back home again. Unlike Chicago or other Rust Belt cities, Manhattan's geography was too complex and contested to conform exactly to this pattern. But quite like its urban counterparts throughout the land, New York was heir to the designs of scheming corporate government alliances. Once condemned by the ideologically freighted terminology of urban blight, zones of relative dilapidation, segregated pockets of vibrant African-American commercial and residential occupancy, for example, extensive and reliable, if untidy, retail corridors like Radio Row, could be targeted for removal by fiat, basically, and made ready for private development, redevelopment. In this connection, it is interesting that the architect who finally got the gig to design the Twin Towers, Minoru Yamasaki, was himself a veteran of urban renewal public housing construction. In 1955, he had done the 33-building Pruitt-Igoe housing project in St. Louis. Seeing as how that complex had been such a hideous disaster, however, it was torn down just 17 years after it went up, the year before the WTC was dedicated. A super-vandalized and scorned victim of its own Corbusian principles. Given such a disastrous result, it is perhaps surprising the World Trade Center took the brutalist form it did. As Eric Darton writes in his definitive biography of the World Trade Center, "Divided we stand," Yamasaki, though claiming that one can't fit the people who use the building into it in any fashion the architect desires just to suit the exterior appearance, in fact demonstrated precisely the opposite in his final design. Inspired like everyone else by Mies van der Rohe's 1951 twin high-rise Shore Drive apartment buildings in Chicago, Yama's version was its monstrous double in its outsized scale, one that he apparently believed could still be inviting, friendly, and humane. That's a quote from him. But as Darton astutely argues, Yamasaki's abstract sculptural ethos achieved a kind of chilling perfection in his World Trade Center design. This is from Eric Darton's book. Here you find yourself in the presence of two monumental structures whose formal relationship gives no indication of their purpose or intent. You know they are office buildings, yet their design makes it nearly impossible to imagine that they are full of people. It is at this point that you realize the trade towers disappear as sites of human habitation and reassert their power at the level of an aesthetic relationship. And it is through recognizing this process that you may become uncomfortably aware of a kindred spirit linking the apparently polar realms of skyscraper terrorist and skyscraper builder. And this book was written before 2001. Terrorist and superblock builder, Darton is right to say, both view human life with a high degree of abstraction, radically removing themselves from mundane existence on the street. Both operate beyond human scale. This was made explicit, moreover, in the form of the doubled towers. They constituted a sort of architectural repetition compulsion, an extreme urge to mastery, attempting to bury the trauma of the contingent, bustling street. They only endlessly reproduced further architectural trauma. They refracted the field of vision in a schizoid seriality. In each building's referring only to its twin, the complex refused intercourse with the city, refused exteriority. At the same time, with their seamless screen faces of alternating stripes of steel and window, 18.25-inch wide aluminum-clad steel columns adjoining just 21.75 inches of glass, they refused to yield up a sense of their contents. You couldn't even tell if the lights were on or not. So voided interiority as well. Only when the buildings came down, as Mark Wigley observes, did it become clear who was occupying them. Quote, the vast range of nationalities, fields, careers, and incomes. The towers had no front, back, or sides, writes Wigley. No depth, each face the same, with no simple view of them in perspective. Pure facade, a pure uninhabited image floating above the city, an image forever above the horizon in some kind of sublime excess, defying our capacity to understand it. Signifying the end of original reference in their two-ness, as Jean Baudrillard puts it in his Requiem for the Twin Towers, they announced a new age in their architectural graphism, digital and countable, a closed, cloned series. One cost of all this, as Gaston Bachelard wrote in The Poetics of Space, is the sacrifice of what he termed the building's dream cellar, the repository of the volatile human urges that gave rise to the building, which allows us to acknowledge, confront, and work through them in our relations with it. Extreme vertical extensions are what Bachelard called onirically incomplete. They evacuate the unconscious. Skyscrapers' elevators, meanwhile, the WTC had no less than 95 of them, do away, Bachelard wrote, with the heroism of stair climbing. Everything about them is mechanical, and on every side, intimate living flees. The Twin Towers made instrumentality the rule of life. Okay, we're getting close to Philippe Petit again. One Frenchman helped kill the street, Corbusier. Another one tried in 1974 to resurrect it, perhaps unconsciously inscribing into the sky the ideas of certain of his radical fellow countrymen and women. Situationist theorizers and activists, I mean to say. To be sure, Philippe Petit's response to the Twin Towers must be seen in the context of the general awed disgust they generated in the early 70s. Such cultural monuments as the Towering Inferno, 1974, the 1976 King Kong, and hilariously mordant 1978 photograph featuring author William S. Burroughs, maybe you know this picture, taking aim at the towers with a rifle from the impossible vantage point of the Brooklyn Bridge, attest to that disgust. It's a funny picture because the scalar absurdity of the idea of killing the buildings with a shotgun conveys, again, their inhuman character. There are indeed uncanny connections here. The Towering Inferno, though set in San Francisco, clearly gestures to the Twin Towers in the way its signature building, the tallest in the world, is flanked by a sort of junior sidekick. And the survivors of its eponymous conflagration are saved by a funicular cable strung from one building to the other, the wire itself erected by shooting a specially strung arrow from a helicopter to the smaller building. But Petit's crew thought of this first. The film premiered the following December after his wire walk. For his part, I'm not even sure how widely known it was that they erected the wire that way. For his part, Kong, with a young Jessica Lange in hand, climbs the World Trade Center's South Tower, jumping across to the other one in his evasion of police helicopters. To no avail, of course, he soon goes down. It's as though culture makers, in order to absorb or take on in any sense you like, the spectacular new presence of the buildings, had to produce counter-spectacles of catastrophe. Let me tell you just a little bit about the Situationists, and then we'll come back to Petit, because I think, though I have not had a chance to talk to Philippe Petit about this, and he says nothing about it in Man on Wire, I think there is very possibly some kind of, at least unconscious, enactment of radical ideas coming out of Paris in the late 60s and early 70s in what he did on the roofs of the Twin Towers. The language of spectacle is appropriate just here, in fact, for the Situationist theorizing of spectacle helps in thinking about Philippe Petit's high-wire feat. This is an unusually fecund theoretical tendency with implications that extend in many directions, including upward. They talked a lot about buildings and floating buildings and stuff like this. They're kind of wacky, often surrealism-charged group of theorizers. I can only briefly note a few of the most useful ideas here, useful to this particular context. The tendency emerged in the early 1950s, first as the Lettrist International, out of an engagement with anarcho-surrealist forebearers. One of their first interventions was a brief takeover of Notre Dame in mock priest garb on Easter Sunday, 1950. 10,000 worshipers on hand, denouncing the Catholic Church for the lethal diversion of our living strength toward an empty heaven. Situationism, as is well known, or ought to be, was documented between 1958 and 1969 in 12 numbers of a collectively edited review called Situationist International. The SI devoted itself to the construction of situations, a playful but deadly serious political intervention into the realm of what Henri Lefebvre had in a 1947 book termed Everyday Life, which had been penetrated by capital to such an extent, writers such as Debord believed, that it was now little less than an environment of alienation, a spectacle commodity economy in need of total reinvention. Not the labor process, but life as intimately lived was the arena of renewal, and that's their advance, as they thought of it, on previous traditions of activism and particularly Marxist theorizing. The SI focused most on a reconstructed urbanism, with the city, Paris above all, less a physical container than the space constituted by and constitutive of the drama of self-consciousness and mutual recognition that lay at the heart of Hegel's phenomenology as well as the early Marx. For a time in the early 60s, Lefebvre's work aligned directly with this vein of thought. His ideas about space and sovereignty his insistence that sovereignty implies space, that spatial production is the ground of sovereignty and politics and ownership and political struggle, and that the contesting of sovereignty also involved the revamping of space. All that stuff key to the situationist paradigm. Theirs was a specifically anti-Corbusian intervention. They referred to Corbusier as Le Corbusier Sing Sing, as in designer of prisons. Decidedly neologistic they were as well. They advocated what they called the dérive, or urban drifting, produced psychogeographic maps of the city, and eagerly sought opportunities for détournement or deturning, the creative misuse or appropriation of urban sites. Greil Marcus writes that they practiced intellectual terrorism. And inseparable, this is a quote, and inseparable from that practice was the theft of intellectual property, as well as the free giving of it, which is why books like The Situationist Reader remain uncopyrighted to this day. We might say that Petit stole the idea of the Twin Towers with his feet, even as he performed for free, though at great actual and greater potential cost. Serge Guilbeault famously argued that New York stole modernism from Paris during the Cold War, when it migrated over forcibly and ideologically and animated the idea of abstract expressionism in the 1950s. Paris returned in the 70s by way of Petit to suggest that cold architectural modernism was dead. The situationist critique of Parisian modernity provided the perfect foil for the articulation of US postmodernity. Situationist enthusiasm for the 1871 Paris Commune was no surprise. They celebrated the Commune as the biggest festival of the 19th century. For them, there was no higher praise. And the anti-statist radicalism endorsed in their writing about it reverberated across the mid to late 1960s left. Their take on the 1965 Watts Rebellion, critique of urbanism. So what's kind of embedded here, and I don't have really time to talk about it, is the revolutions in France, one in February, as Marx narrates it, and which is a sort of bourgeois revolution in February of 1848, kind of animated from below with barricades, avec barricades, in June, during the June days of 1848, which is put down by Louis Bonaparte in 1851, 3 years later, and the empire is restored. This elicits some of Marx's greatest writing, mid-19th century. Haussmann is brought in the late 1850s and early 1860s to put in those boulevards. We're not going to let this happen again. 10 years later, 1871, the Paris Commune happens when, for 2 months, a group of workers and many others shut down the city by claiming space at Place Vendôme in a hotel, in a big kind of sort of palatial building called the Hotel de Ville. And one of the big symbolic acts is to pull down the Vendôme column, very famously. This, in turn, has elicited a lot of writing theorizing from the likes of Marshall Berman and David Harvey and T.J. Clark and others. The destruction of the normal routines of alienated everyday life was the goal of the Situationists' theory of unitary urbanism. In their place, to be instituted the festival, like the Commune, that realization of revolutionary urbanism, as they thought. As Lefebvre had it, the revolution of the future will put an end to the everyday. It will usher in prodigality and lavishness and break our fetters, violently or peaceably, as the case may be. This was, in effect, a return to the later Marx of the Civil War in France, 1870s Marx, in which Marx turned on certain of his earlier positions. There can be, he says in 1871, no simple seizing of the state, unlike what he said before, without reproducing certain of its brutalities and bureaucratic banalities. And this is, as Kristen Ross has it, a post-mature Marx returning to his early 1840s themes. As for the Commune, wrote Marx, the proof of its success was simply its own brief working existence. With that in mind, with that in mind, as sort of kind of immediate theoretical context and political context, and the New York urban context sort of a little bit in place there. I want to give you a sense of, just by playing some minutes from Man on Wire, of just how all this unfolded. And then I'll talk in conclusion a little bit about what I take to be the importance of the intervention of this event. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to say something that eludes me now. It'll probably come up. I have in conclusion just some remarks that I think of as Petit theses. First of all, it concerns festival and circus. Petit brings a circus aesthetic, a festivalization of everyday life to Lower Manhattan. He enacts a performative dream work. Man on Wire is, in fact, suffused with the language of dreams, condensing and displacing a series of social encasements and their figurations. Man on Wire may be a little too hagiographic about it all, but Petit does enact this dream work, which, as I say, condenses and displaces a series of social encasements and their figurations: walking, building with the construction hat, the hard hat, raising, tearing down, sightseeing is a sightseeing, there's tourist on the wire, performance of everyday life. There is here, as Kristen Ross writes of the Commune, a displacement of the political onto seemingly peripheral areas of everyday life. The organization of space and time, changes in lived rhythms and social ambiances. As though to suggest what real political change would amount to, the morning commute is disrupted, milling about is encouraged, new and spontaneous uses of urban space are activated. Something like Randy Martin's book, Critical Moves, comes into view here, and its important homologies between performative moving and activist social movement. In any case, Petit produces a valuable interruption of the coercive choreography of the here and now. So that's one thing. Another thing has to do with collaborative illegality, in my view. There is, in this series of events, a post-surrealist symbolic occupation of private, highly defended ground, in the face, as it were, of 70s surveillance paranoia, such as you see in films like Clute, The Conversation, The Parallax View, Network, and All the President's Men. Or rather, what is at the time thought of as inviting new public space, the Austin Tobin Plaza, a much bruited public observation platform high up in the North Tower, the windows on the World Restaurant on the top floor of, I think it was the South Tower, the very view of the buildings as public skyline possessions of all New Yorkers and all visitors to New York. All this is revealed instead to be privatized space, benefiting only a certain class of people. That is why what Petit and his comrades do is against the law, why he gets arrested. Petit's performance momentarily turns monuments to global capital into theatrical stages, confiscates, we might say, the public remainder of these buildings for counter-public joy. This is a reminder, in turn, that to desire things otherwise is to live out of step with normative time and space. Not for nothing is Man on Wire organized as a heist film. Something's being stolen here, and by a group of people fully collaborating until they don't any longer, and we can talk about this, because once they do this, the group kind of busts apart, and they haven't seen each other in years by the time the film is put together. People fully collaborating on a creative, collective effort. And this is why Man on Wire is, in fact, hardly a documentary at all, more of a reenactment film, and a little cheesy at that, at times. The conditions under which our conspirators worked made it impossible to film for posterity most of what they did, because they were breaking the law, and the conditions were not hospitable. There is the reorienting of spatial relations, the creation of joyful chaos and wonder in the street, even among the cops and judges. He spoke French, being that he was a Frenchman. An ironic creation of new real estate up in the air, habitable by only one, but for us to share in profound psychological sympathy. Petit, in my view, is precisely not Evel Knievel, trying to launch a motorcycle over a line of dead cars or across the Grand Canyon. This is a specifically urban art crime, a unitary urbanist intervention that reclaims public space at the grinding hour of the working day's start. This act makes singular the twin towers, both in the sense of joining them, rendering them momentarily, architecturally more sane, and symbolically destroying their pleonastic, overbearing quality. There's another way in which you might read the Petit act as through the theorizing of Michel de Certeau and his book, The Practice of Everyday Life, in terms of what de Certeau calls a rhetoric of walking. De Certeau has a memorable scene in its own right from the standpoint of the Windows on the World restaurant. Petit makes the city new in his wire walk. He invents the city by walking in new ways through it, and in a way that only he could kind of produce or invent by casting that wire across the chasm in order to be able to walk across it. And this is also, incidentally, why the Eric Satie music that plays when he sets out across the chasm in the clip we just saw, that piano music, the gymnopédie or gymnopédie, however you say it. The music that plays during this walk is so appropriate because Satie was himself a kind of post-surrealist, a big walker who walked miles every day into and out of Paris through the arrondissement and, was a kind of psychogeographer before his time. There's another way in which Petit produces an unconscious for buildings that certain scholars and theorists argue those buildings voided. As I said, Man on Wire is full of the language of dreams. It starts with a dream that he has, that he's forgotten to nail some box shut, which I read as a kind of figure for his own fear of death. He's forgotten to bring something along that's going to be crucial at a certain point in the walk. Or other people speak of the dream that they have of conquering the towers, or the dreams to which conquering the towers gave rise. All this speaks to me of a kind of World Trade Center with an unconscious, all of a sudden, because of this act. There is a moment, two final things. There is a moment in the film when Petit says this thing, you're like, why did you? Okay, well, all right, if you really want to know why, I don't know, maybe I wanted to escape my time, he says. An urge to transcendence, a kind of fugitivity that involves his risking self-sacrifice in the production of everyday life. In fact, reintroducing vulnerability to an architecture, I think, of denial. Certain people have argued that this is an architecture of denial, denies that vulnerability exists in buildings, in bodies, or bodies inside buildings. He restores Bachelar's heroism of stair climbing. And finally, I think what I've tried to argue here is that Petit's 1974 Wire Walk was a new kind of ephemeral textuality or performance art. A new theater of the air on beautiful stages, that's Petit's line, framed by death, also his line. Performance theorist Jose Munoz has written that per Ernst Bloch, Marxist theorist of utopian yearnings, that art is the pre-appearance in the world of another mode of being that is not yet here. Petit's is a sort of surplus value, a production that in its exquisite inutility cannot be conscripted by capital, a disruptive integer counter to modernity's compulsory steps. It's a kind of death art that Petit risks, which moves beyond death as finitude, producing a future in the present. Thank you.